Hello, my fellow criminals. It's Melder here with a Marchesa Dealer of Death deck tech. In my last video, I talked about my favorite deck to play so far in 2024, and today we're going to go a little bit more in depth and talk all about Marchesa Dealer of Death. And before we get into the rest of the deck, we have to talk about Marchesa herself. So, Marchesa, Dealer of Death, is a legendary creature human rogue for Grixis mana, blue, black, and red. And she is also a 3/4. Now, her ability reads, whenever you commit a crime, you may pay 1 generic mana. If you do, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the other into your graveyard. And crimes was a mechanic that came out with Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and the reminder text says, targeting opponents, anything they control, and or cards in their graveyards counts as a crime. Now, what I love the most about Marchesa Dealer of Death is she's really open-ended with her ability. I mean, you can commit crimes in many different ways in Commander. And this leads to you being able to employ a variety of different strategies. And I think the biggest difference between Marchesa decks here is how do you commit crimes? Now, from what I've gathered online and seen, the most popular Marchesa Dealer of Deck style is a Grixis control list that just wins through card advantage using spot removal and counter magic, and then winning with some sort of combo in the end. I mean, you're in Grixis colors, you have access to some of the best combos in EDH. Another strategy I've seen pretty commonly online is Reanimator lists. Now, Marchesa is very good at filtering creatures into the graveyard and putting your key reanimation pieces into your hand. You don't have to worry about milling yourself and then losing your reanimate or your rise or anything like that. It just goes right to your hand if you need it, and you can also fill your graveyard at the same time. Now, what I think makes my list a little bit different than some of these other lists is that it is an artifact deck, and it focuses on very cheap artifacts that target opponents, and I can use those effects repeatedly throughout the game, and it's not just like a one-time use thing. It's just every single turn I can commit multiple crimes per turn and accumulate a ton of card advantage that way. So I'm going to break down each of the card types, and the first card type we're going to talk about is creatures. Now, starting off, we have a few different discounters for artifacts, those being Enthusiastic Mechanaut, Joyrus Familiar, and Ethereum Sculptor. Now, these creatures, they discount artifacts by 1 generic mana, so it could turn a Soul Ring into a 0-drop, it could turn a Talisman into a 1-drop or a 0-drop, and so on. So I added these just to smooth out the process of getting my artifact engine on board, and the artifact discounters are always just a solid to have when your whole strategy involves getting a bunch of artifacts out there. Now, the next one is just various different engine pieces that are not artifact based. So we have Joyra, Weatherlight Captain. Now, Joyra is a 4-mana 3/3. And when you cast a historic spell, you draw a card. Now, this is one of the many ways to draw cards that isn't involving crimes, and since Jorah cares so much about mainly artifacts, but historic spells in general, I'm going to be drawing tons of cards from her ability. After that, we have Talion, the Kindly Lord. Now, Talion is just one of those generically very strong cards. It doesn't really have that much synergy in the deck at all, but I do own a copy of Talion, and I wanted to make use of it because I think the card's very cool. So I decided to slot it in. This is definitely one of the cards I will take out of the deck as I start to get more of the pieces together, because, you know, the deck isn't obviously complete yet. So once I get more pieces, Talion will probably be phased out, though it is a 3/4 flying blocker, which is nice, and it does help drain based on the number and also help me draw cards. So in casual tables, I'll normally name 2 or 3 as the Talion number. In CEDH, I believe 1 and 2 are the best things to name most of the times. But yeah, most of the time I'm naming 2 or 3. It hits a lot of the mana rocks, or as well as a lot of spells just have like 3, or creatures have a lot of like 3 toughness. So get pretty consistent results through Talion that way. After that, we have Padim. Padim allows me to draw a card if I control the artifact with the highest mana value at the start of my upkeep. And it also gives my artifacts hexproof. So she's a pretty solid creature in artifact-based decks. I don't really worry too much about a lot of my artifacts getting spot removed, because most of them are like 1 or 2 mana and pretty innocuous while they're on board. But she just adds an extra layer of protection while also getting me a card here and there. I do have some higher mana cost artifacts like Kappa Cannoneer and Vidalcan Orrery and like Arcbound Condor, and not many people are running very, very expensive artifacts. So I tend to have the upper hand with her ability. Also, she counts ties as well, which is nice. And yeah, just protection and card draw that way. After that, some notable cards. Fairy Mastermind, very similar to Talion in the sense that I own several copies of Fairy Mastermind. I don't really have a place to put them, so it's got me some value here and there. Obviously, I think Fairy Mastermind does better or gets more value in like a CEDH table, where people are drawing many, many cards per turn because of, like Rhystic Studies and all that are way more common in CEDH than casual. But Fairy Mastermind does decent amount of work in this deck, and one of the cards I am looking to phase out potentially as well. After that, we have Emery, Lurker of the Loch. Emery is a 2 and a blue for a 1/2, and Emery's just one of those creatures that does super well in artifact-based strategies. She costs less based on the amount of artifacts you control, and she allows you to cast artifacts from your graveyard when you tap her. She also allows you to mill 4 cards on ETB, though that effect isn't as prevalent with this deck. I mainly just care about the casting artifacts from graveyard, just in case I'm missing any of the key artifact pieces. Next up, we have the crime-committing creature cards. Now, a lot of these have or several of them have the Summoning Sickness kind of tempo hit. So Orcish Spy and Amoeboid Changeling, they require me to tap, which I would just rather those effects be on artifacts. And if I get artifacts that fill that slot, I'll probably take them out. Orcish Spy is a bit of a cute card because you can look at the top 3 cards of someone's library, and that is pretty decent information, especially if I have the opportunity to mill people with a ton of the mill rocks that I have for the deck. And Amoeboid Changeling, it can kind of turn off lords and other creature type based strategies, but it's generally just a cheap creature that I can use to commit a crime. Also, it's just a silly little guy. I mean, look at it. Like, this thing is so funny. And just picturing the Amoeboid Changeling just committing a bunch of crimes, it's just so goofy to me. So I keep it in for that reason as well. Probably the best crime-committing creatures in the deck include Hedron Crab, which is 1 mana for a 0/2, and it has Landfall. Now, Landfall is very strong in my opinion, and it allows me to target a player to mill 3 cards when I play a land, so it's basically a free crime at that point, and it does not require me to tap. I can get it out super early because it's 1 mana. And yeah, definitely one of the best crime committers in the deck. And next is Arcbound Condor, which is a combination of like removal, which is a crime, and also it's just... yeah, this card is just so nasty. It's an uncommon for Modern Horizons 3. It has Modular 3 and Flying, so it gets 3+1/+1 counters on ETB. And whenever an artifact enters the battlefield, I can target a creature an opponent controls and give it -1/-1 until end of turn. So this is not only just a crime in general, if I need to. It can also remove a bunch of stuff like dorks and low toughness creatures just for playing artifacts, absolutely amazing. It is an artifact itself, so it synergizes super well in multiple different ways. And I think this is one of the hidden MVPs for my creatures in this Marchesa deck. After that, we have some of the crime payoffs. Uh, the main ones are just Gisa the Hellraiser and then Magda the Hordemaster. So Magda gets a tap treasure whenever I commit a crime, and it's limited to one per turn. But with some other cards featured later, I can get multiple of the treasures per turn and then be able to untap them. So I have a ton of mana advantage. And then Gisa the Hellraiser, she is a way to make a bunch of bodies and an army of 3/3 menace blue black zombies. So their base toughness and power 2/2, but she's also a lord. So she buffs them up by +1/+1 and gives them Menace. This is one of the ways the deck can win after a long slog if I need to swing in for combat. She accumulates a ton of zombies because she's making 2 per turn, and it is limited to once per turn, sadly, but if I have multiple crime committers, I can do one on each turn and accumulate a massive army of zombies. Like, I've had like 20 plus zombies before on board, and it's not that difficult with the rest of the deck's cards that help synergize with this ability. And then lastly, the powerhouse creatures. We have Kappa Cannoneer and Hullbreaker Horror. Hullbreaker Horror is just a ridiculous card. I mean, this thing, it can bounce spells off the stack, and it also can bounce permanents from the board as well. So it can delay people. It controls the board unbelievably well. It's also a 7/8, and it's uncounterable. I can flash it in as well. I have a ton of low-cost cards, especially like the artifacts and things like that. So I can just control the board, and this also counts as committing crimes. So absolute monster top end to the deck. This thing can basically put me in a winning situation, win me the game itself, and very, very strong. Lastly, we have Kappa Cannoneer. Kappa Cannoneer is a very strong artifact creature card. It has word 4, which is insane. It also can improvise, meaning my artifacts can help cast the spell. And a lot of the artifacts, even though most of them are tap abilities, there are some I don't mind tapping to really cast this, which is very nice. And when it enters the battlefield or another artifact enters, it gets a +1/+1 counter, and then it can't be blocked. So this thing can get very, very large, swing in for a ton of damage, and is one of the ways I can help close out games if I've accumulated enough counters on it. The last creatures are just the combo piece creatures, and I'm going to talk about the combo later. If you've seen you can see the creatures here, so you can probably infer what the combo is. But Blood Artist, Judith, Mayhem Devil, they all are sacrifice a permanent or creature, or one of my creatures dies, or any creature dies, and I can do 1 damage to any target or make target opponent lose 1 life, depending on which one it is. So those are crimes in itself, and also allow me to close out games with the Forsaken Miner combo. Very quick is going to be the sorceries. There are only 4 sorceries in this deck, 3 of them being reanimation pieces, and then the last one being Git Probe. For the reanimation pieces, I think all 3 of them are quite good in the deck, and Marchesa decks in general. I mentioned the reanimation aspect of her, and with like Stitch Together, you can hit the threshold very easily. And Victimize, I'm making... some of the creatures here aren't really that useful, honestly, and it helps me get bigger things. Like, I could sacrifice any of my discounters. I could just bring it back with Emery as well. And also, I can get Hullbreaker Horror back, or something like Italian back, and Gisa back, Kappa Cannoneer, all that good stuff. So these I definitely think I will phase out as the deck list evolves more. I think I'll keep probably Reanimate, but Stitch Together and Victimize are cards I am super willing to slot out of the deck in favor of more artifact synergies. I just need to acquire the cards required to do so. I'm just going to go through the instance very quickly. It is nothing too special or different here. We have a very basic counter spell package with an offer you can't refuse, counter spell, negate, null elemental blast, and stoic rebuttal. I think stoic rebuttal is probably the most out there one. It's an artifact deck, and the likelihood of having 3 or more artifacts out on the board to reduce the cost by 1 is quite high. So I treat it just as another version of Counterspell with a little bit of artifact synergy. And then also we have Null Elemental Blast, and this spell is a bait, I would say, for most players and most decks, because it does require a colorless mana to be able to cast it. And this deck has 16 colorless mana sources, so the likelihood of casting this is very high. I have not run into a situation where I cannot cast it and want to. And it's great for a commander because many people run multicolored commanders. And if you look at like the EDH Rec top 10 commanders, most of them are, if not all of them, are multicolor. There are not that many multicolor spells besides that you'd want to counter that come up. I mean, there's something like a Culling Ritual hits this deck extremely hard, but most of the time it's just removal for commanders more so than a counter spell. The other stuff is just pretty standard removal. I have Resculpt for an exile that can also hit artifacts. We have Lightning Bolt, Infernal Grasp, and Dismember. I guess Snap also kind of counts as removal in a way as well. These are very basic removal spells. This is probably the point of the deck that could be improved upon the most outside of the win cons. And yeah, I mean, it's very minimal removal. It's mostly just stuff I had lying around. I have a few other pieces that I do plan on adding back to the deck. I'm just testing different things and working with this removal package at the moment. Return the Favor and Sea Double are two of the spells that are probably the most out there for this style of deck. Return the Favor is a spell copier or redirector. I haven't had any situation where I could play this yet, and I haven't really had it in my hand, which is sadly one of the nature of one-ofs or singleton format decks. So this is definitely under testing still. And then Sea Double, I have been able to play several times. It's worked out for me very well. And the copying, I mean, 4 mana for a copy of a creature is on rate. And you can also, it's modal spell, so you can use it to copy spells as well. So, I mean, Sea Double, I don't plan on taking out. I like this card quite a bit. Return the Favor is something I'm working with. And then, Frantic Search is one of my favorite cards of all time, so I definitely don't plan on taking that out. I might remove Snap for more harder removal, something like maybe a Braid or maybe a Reality Shift, as well as some of the other cards like Overwhelming Remorse, which is a nice mono black exile spell. So a bunch of different options that I have available to me, and I'm going to be working with adding more removal into the deck as this deck gets improved upon more. So next we're going to go over the land base. It's a pretty basic land base aside from like 1 or 2 of the cards. And all of the expensive cards like the Polluted Delta and the Undercity Sewers are cards that I like. The Undercity Sewers I opened from a pack, which I was fortunate to get, but I don't think it has actually that much value in the deck here. It's mainly better for 1v1 formats, I think. And then the Polluted Delta is just to get like a Xander's Lounge or maybe the Undercity Sewers for color fixing. Aside from that, yeah, it's pretty low to the ground. There are these desert lands that ping for 1 that I call crime lands. So they do enter tapped, which is a bit unfortunate, but they do tap for 2 colors or either color, so better for color fixing. And importantly, they commit a crime. So if I Even though I'm taking kind of a tempo hit for this, I still get card advantage from playing a land, which is nice. So I think as a budget include for a Marchesa deck, these are pretty decent. If I had better lands to work with, I would probably phase them out for just like better dual lands. Like Shocks obviously are the better of the choices. But for here, I think they work fine. And they also help synergize with Scavenger Grounds if I need to use the effect multiple times because they are deserts. And the other desert synergy isn't really that prevalent, but it does help a little bit. Now, more importantly, I think, is the Seething Landscape. This was a common for Modern Horizons 3, and I think this card and the cards like it, the whole cycle, is really good, especially if you're on a budget. I mean, this card's like 30 cents, and it has 3 different effects, so it's super useful. Tap for a colorless mana. You can also tap it and sacrifice it to search for a basic land of the type of the 3-color trio. Or you can cycle it. I mean, the rate is pretty expensive, but you can still cycle it to draw a card. And yeah, this card is just better than like Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wilds. It's just a really solid card, especially for the budget includes. So if you aren't running these and you're in like 3 colors or more, highly consider these cards because they are quite nice. Now the main event. We have the artifacts. I'm gonna break this into a few different sections. First, we have mana rocks. We have like the basics: Soul Ring, Talismans, Felwar Stone, Arcane Signet. You've seen it all before, so it's not worth mentioning or going into detail about. If you notice, though, we do have 2 3-mana rocks in Commander's Sphere and Bandit's Hall, and then we have some tapped rocks like Cold Steel Heart and Solar Transformer. I think that, I mean, I personally don't mind these at all, at least in casual decks. Bandit's Hall does have pretty decent synergy, getting loot counters for committing crimes, and then drawing cards by spending those loot counters and 2 mana. And you're committing so many crimes with this deck that you're gonna have an excess of loot counters, and it just if you're kind of flooded, Bandit's Hall allows you to kind of get out of that at least a little bit. And then Commander's Sphere is fine in casual, I think. It also can draw a card for 1 time, but you have to remember that with all of the artifact discount cards, a lot of these aren't costing 3. They're costing 2 or 1 most of the time, and sometimes they're even free. So I think spending 2 or 1 mana on Commander Sphere is obviously way better. And I'm rarely spending 3 on it, so I don't mind putting it in. And I just had a copy lying around, or copies lying around. Cold Steel Heart is decent for color fixing as well. I opened like the anime Jumpstart art, so I guess I'll use it. And it's not bad as well. It's pretty fine. It's not really gotten me in any bad situations using it. I haven't taken that big of a tempo hit where I'm like, damn, I have to take out this tap rock. So yeah, it's fine and casual. I think Solar Transformer is actually super good. Another Modern Horizons 3 card. And it does ETB tapped, but you get 3 energy counters, and you can either pay 1 energy to get a mana of any color, or tap for a colorless mana. And since it's, I guess, modal, I suppose, you can, it's quite flexible. I can use it to commit crimes and not have to worry about the colored mana. And then if I really need the colored mana for something, I can use the energy for it. And even if I run out of energy, it's still a very useful card. So next up, we're going to talk about the crime committers. I'll break these up into different forms. We have the graveyard hate ones. So this is cards like Relic of Progenitus. We have Phyrexian Furnace. We have Scrabbling Claws. And we have Unlicensed Hearse. I'm going to bring them all up at the same time on screen just so you can read them all. And I don't have to say every single line of text because they all just exile cards from graveyards. Next, we have the mill cards. So that includes Codex Shredder, Grind Clock, and Wand of Denial. Wand Denial is a pretty spicy card in my opinion because you can see the top card of someone's library and choose if you want to mill it or not. And I can pair this with other cards that like Orcish Spire or whatever to like make someone mill or whatever, but Mainly, it's like if I see a really strong card on the top that I want in the graveyard, I can just pay 2 life. I also can do some top deck manipulation for myself if need be. So this card is quite versatile, actually. I've been pretty surprised with how the quality of this card, at least in the context of this Marchesa deck. And it's been pretty fun to use as well. Also, Grind Clock, just a quick note, you can just have 0 charge counters on it and make someone mill X, where X equals 0. So it's a pretty nice way to commit crimes as well. Now, the last few are just like random crime committers. We have Distorting Lens, which changes the color of target permanent for 1 turn. We have Tower of Coireel, which is a target creature cannot be blocked by walls until end of turn, which is super funny. And Glasses of Urza, which I think is actually quite a good card in this deck because it's just pay 1, tap, then activate Marchesa. And also, getting information I think is pretty underrated, at least in casual Commander. Just seeing someone's with like a full grip of cards and seeing exactly what they have available to them allows for more room for counterplay, which I like. And it's just a funny card in general as well. And then lastly, we have the bigger artifacts. We have first Vidalcan Orrery. Now, I love the art for this specific card. The Scott M. Fisher art is absolutely gorgeous, and I had this card sitting in my binder for so long and I just couldn't stand it, so I wanted to put it in a deck and I put it in here. I haven't had a chance to actually use the card in this deck yet, but obviously it's quite decent. I think 4 mana is a little expensive for what the deck's trying to do, but if it gets discounted, it can put in a good amount of work, and that allows me to play at flash speed and pairs well with the next card, which is Unwinding Clock. Obviously, Unwinding Clock is a very, very powerful card in artifact decks, especially. I just untap all my artifacts during other people's untap steps, so I can, however many artifact crime committers I have, I commit that many crimes per everybody's turn, each player's turn. And that's one of the reasons why I have so many mana rocks, including tapped ones, because it just gets me more crimes and Marchesa triggers per turn. And this also pairs well with like Magda because she makes tap treasure tokens on other people's turns, and she's limited to 1 crime per turn. Same with stuff like Gisa and Kappa Cannoneer. Like, it basically gives Kappa Cannoneer vigilance. And with Gisa, even though the zombies aren't artifacts, since it's limited to once per turn, I can just maximize my output of zombies and Magda treasures from Unwinding Clock. So it's kind of like a pseudo win con. It turns the engine of crime committing to like from strong or pretty strong feeling to like overwhelming. I'm just accumulating so many cards with this. It just is ridiculous. And normally with Unwinding Clock, it kind of takes up a lot of the time equity, or makes the time equity of the game more skewed in the person with Unwinding Clock. And I think with this deck, since I'm able to shortcut a lot of these crimes, I don't have to take up too much time from other players' turns. I can just, if I've seen someone's hand with Glasses of Urza, their hand is not going to change from my turn to the next player's turn, especially if it hasn't been their turn yet. So I can just repeat it onto someone and not even bother looking at it. I can say, you mill 0, you mill 1, look at your hand. And they all understand. I don't actually need to do some of the other stuff. Milling 0 does literally nothing besides lets me activate Marchesa. So I can kind of spin my wheels and then give them information as needed without just taking over their turn and making the game all about me, which tends to be a play pattern that is commonly seen with Unwinding Clock, and I don't really like that. So normally you'd have that issue, but here it's not as bad, I don't think, at least from my perspective. Now, lastly, we have Phyrexian Altar, and this is where I'm going to talk about actual win cons of the deck. So we have, as mentioned, things like Hullbreaker Horror and Kappa Cannoneer. But with Phyrexian Altar, we have Blood Artist, Judith, and Mayhem Devil, and those, if you are not aware, go infinite with Forsaken Miner. I sack Forsaken Miner to Phyrexian Altar for a black. That triggers one of these 3 creatures, which also counts as a crime because they're all targeted. And then I can use that crime and the black mana to bring Forsaken Miner back. And that goes infinite, drain out the table, or do damage to the table until the game is over. And obviously this combo is pretty boring. At least I think it is. Yeah, this is how the deck wins most of the games. And I don't run tutors in the deck. And the reason why is because of this combo. I think tutors make the deck too strong because it's such a hard combo to interact with. And it doesn't really need my commander out. So I think tutors just take away from the gameplay experience for myself of spinning my wheels, and also create situations where I kind of win out of nowhere and it's not really fun for anybody. Okay, let's talk about the cards that I am changing for this deck. Now, I'm taking out Fairy Mastermind, Phyrexian Altar, Blood Artist, Mayhem Devil, Stitch Together, Judith the Scourge Diva, Forsaken Miner, and Lightning Greaves. And I'm adding in Cyberdrive Awakener, Baleful Mastery, Ghostfire Slice, Tyrant Scorn, Cranial Ram, Vandal Blast, and Nettle Cyst. And my goal with adding these new additions is I want to add more removal, first of all, but I also want to change up my win con to a more combat-centric one, using Cyberdrive Awakener to animate all of my non-creature artifacts. They will become 4/4s with flying, and then swing in that way. I can also buff some of my creatures with the equipments like Cranial Ram, Cranial Plating, and Nettle Cyst to swing in really hard and high, using like Kappa Cannoneer when it's unblockable. Now, sadly, you cannot use equipment with Cyberdrive Awakener due to state-based actions because it becomes a creature. But I can still use either form of combat win that way. So that's going to be it for my Marchesa Dealer of Death deck tech. This has been one of my favorite decks to put together and to play over the past few months. And yeah, I'll definitely try to post some sort of update video down the line, just talking about new experiences with the deck and the new win cons and how that's been going. But I just want to say thanks everyone for watching, and especially watching the last video. I was really surprised about how fast it got so many views. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching. Hopefully you have a great rest of your day, and peace out.